So obviously the reason I've contacted GMP was because of these claims made by the Observer. I'll tell you specifically what he said. He said he's seen children, disabled people and old people assaulted. By that I think he means pushing them in the back during the march.
Right.
He also said he's witnessed police kicking people's shins, stamping on people's feet, grabbing them around the head and punching them. What would you have to say about that?
Well, obviously that's not something I'd recognise from the policing operation down at Barton Moss. The thing I'd point out in terms of the whole of that site is that whenever there's a policing operation down there, we video it. One for evidence of potential offences, but we also video it because if people make allegations about the police officers, it's important that we have an independent record of what's actually happened. Because if a police officer's done something wrong, they're accountable, and we'll make sure they're accountable for that. But equally, it is a tactic on some occasions for people to make malicious allegations about the police officers, and we've certainly seen that on this case. In addition to the police filming it, then the protesters, I think if you've been down to the site you'll be aware that everyone seems to have a mobile phone pointing at a police officer. The challenge I'd make back is that when we have a complaint we will investigate it, but surely if there were those outrageous type of acts that we've been accused of, then it will be on film. So it will be on our film. Equally, the protesters are filming everything. So if there was that sort of activity going on, I've no doubt whatsoever that they will produce some sort of footage. And from our perspective, it's very easy for people to make allegations of the most serious nature, and understandably on occasions the media will actually give them airtime. And that can be really damaging to us because people may well believe it to some degree. What we see is people making some allegations. We had one suggestion that someone had broken his leg. Now that got media coverage, but then 2 days later he's running up and down the road. We've had other people making serious allegations to the media, but they won't make the follow-up allegation to us, because if we get the allegation, we'll investigate it thoroughly. So if someone's claiming broken bones, etc., then one of the things that we'd look at is getting the medical evidence to prove it. So I'm always have a degree of suspicion when people make outlandish claims about acts that, if they were true, would be really serious, but then won't follow it up to allow an investigation. So if people make the allegations, we'll investigate them, but I would urge some caution in terms of some of the things that we're alleged to have done.
So do you know, have you had any formal complaints at all about brutality at the site?
Well, I think brutality is a very emotive word. There's certainly been complaints about police actions, and I think round about 30 I think formal complaints that we've had. Now if you bear in mind that when we started the operation it was late October, early November, typically we'll run 4 days a week with HGVs going in and out of the site. So that's several thousand HGV movements. On a given day we can have anything between 15 to 100 protesters and a number of police officers. So when you actually look at the number of complaints we've had, and some of the complaints are motivated to take issue with the police, it's not an unreasonable number. And certainly we have some complainants who will make repeat complaints. In terms of the allegations, any allegation about police misconduct we'll treat seriously. But as yet, I think it'd be sensible to wait for the outcomes of those investigations so that we work on the basis of the facts and not sensational claims that people make. And in some cases, people with perhaps a vested interest or an issue against the police.
So you talked about obviously the police record, you know, all the protests and that. That footage, would it only be watched if there had been claims, you know, of against police actions, or is it watched through all of it, you know, just to check that everything was?
Well, we won't just watch it just to check. I mean, we've had now 204 arrests. So where we can, every one of those arrests is filmed, as I say, both for evidence but also to negate any allegations about police behaviour. So certainly if there's an arrest and it's going to court, then that will be watched and reviewed and be used in interviews. If there's an allegation, then clearly we'll identify that footage. I mean, it's possible that something could be alleged to happen not on camera, but I think those would be limited cases really, but only really if it was something where we had cause for concern or a prosecution would we specifically go through that. The other thing to bear in mind is that whenever there's police activity down there, there's a full command suite running with commanders who are looking at the footage, both anything on the internet but also our own coverage, so we're fully aware of what's going on. So there's a really high degree of scrutiny about what the police are actually doing down there.
Right, okay. I know you've obviously mentioned there's been a lot of arrests down there.
Yeah.
I think from what I've seen, a lot of people have been claiming it's when they've been arrested that they've injured themselves, sort of when they've been, you know, pushed down onto the ground to get their handcuffs on them. I know I've seen pictures of a guy who claims he had his eye socket shattered, and he does look very bruised and battered, and he says it's as a result of being pushed down on the ground while he's being arrested.
Well, interestingly, that person in question hasn't made a complaint to us, so it limits our ability to thoroughly investigate that. And if it's the case I'm thinking of, yeah, there was some scratching to his face, but in a number of instances we'll see people resisting arrest even passively. So if you're a grown adult and you decide you're not going to be arrested and you just let your weight drop, it makes it difficult for the police officers. We then have to use more police officers because we can't just drag someone down the road by the ankles. We've got to pick them up. It's for their safety. So a number of officers will then go and lift them up. So if someone goes passive but non-compliant, then they inevitably will go to the floor because they've got to be managed. But that's typically the choice of the person concerned, or if the person's being violent or resisting the officer, then one of the techniques may be that they may be taken to the floor. But the majority of cases, if someone is arrested and then goes with the officers without resisting, then there won't be the need to take them to the floor. So I think it's important to look at each individual case on its merit, look what's happening, look what the person who's been arrested is doing, and then you can make a proper evaluation about how the arrest has been made.
So if some people, you know, if it is a necessity to bring someone to the ground, do you have sort of procedures in place to make sure that you do that safely, to make sure someone won't smack their head on the ground?
We can never guarantee it. Clearly, one of the things that we do and the techniques that the officers use will, wherever they can be, Home Office approved techniques. So the officers are trained, they're taught about the safe way, both for themselves and the person that they're arrested, to try and detain them and arrest them safely. So they will try and work with those techniques wherever they can. But if someone is certainly being violent, or if someone's being non-compliant, then it gets harder. It gets harder to manage someone as safely as we would possibly like. But in all the circumstances I've seen, the officers have used the minimum force necessary to actually try and effect someone's arrest.
Okay. Now I know obviously there's a very, very large police presence down there during the marches. When I was there, I asked an officer how many police officers she thought was there, and she estimated perhaps around 100 police officers were there. Why do you have evidence that you need that sort of necessary force when was about 30 peaceful protesters, 34 peaceful protesters?
Well, just to go through that, typically on a day we'll probably have 60 police officers there. It started off as more because we didn't know what to expect, because the only precedent we had was Balcombe. On occasions there were hundreds of protesters, so we were trying to gauge the level of resources so that we can manage it safely for our officers, for the public and the protesters themselves. So out of that 60, what we will typically have, we'll have a number of officers who are there as evidence gatherers. So we've spoken about the need to film what goes on, so there'll be a number of officers there for that. One of the key parts of our strategy has been to negotiate with people. So we have police liaison officers, and they're the officers in a blue bib. Now their job is to go to protesters and say, right, we'll facilitate your protest, but we want to do it safely. And they'll try and negotiate about how we can work through the protest. Because I've got three things I need to balance really. So if you think about what I'm trying to achieve in the police operation, number one is keep people safe. That is the overriding thing, and that trumps everything else really. But then I've got three objectives that I need to try and meet. One is I need to let people go about the lawful business. So what iGas are doing is legal. It's legal business. They have a right to do that. The people who are driving for them have a right to be able to drive up and down there. So that's one obligation that I've got, and it's not just me saying that, that's in human rights legislation. People have a right to work. I have an obligation to facilitate peaceful protest. And I think we do that. So people are allowed to protest, and we would never try and restrict that. It's really important in democracy. And the final leg is we've got to try and minimise disruption to the local community, because there's people who live down there, there are businesses down there who need to be able to go about their normal lives, and they'll be there long after iGas have gone and the protesters have gone. So I'm trying to balance each of those competing needs while trying to keep everyone safe. Now, going back to the number of officers, we've got officers to film, we've got officers to try and negotiate with the protesters. We've got detective officers who will deal with the prisoners, and that varies. So today we've had no arrests, no issues at all, a comfortable walk, and everyone was fine. Yesterday there was a very different dynamic, and we approached it in exactly the same way, but because of the behaviour of the protesters, or some of the protesters, there were 9 arrests. So you've got to have people to deal with them. If you've got protesters who aren't going to be compliant, it'll take up to 4 police officers to remove 1 person. The convoys of HGVs will typically, it may be 2 vehicles, on occasions it may be 12 vehicles. Now if you can imagine 12 HGVs in a line, that gets to be quite a long convoy. The road itself is very narrow, the trucks are big, and we've had protesters try to secure themselves to moving vehicles. On one occasion, a protester attached themselves to a moving HGV by the neck with a D-lock, which clearly places them at significant risk. So if you imagine that convoy of 12 HGVs, and I've got to put officers at the front to deal with possibly over 100 protesters, I've then got to station officers down the side of the convoy to stop people attaching themselves for it, because it's dangerous for them, it's possibly dangerous for the drivers, and it's dangerous for the police officers. Then you can see how that 60 staff quickly gets eaten away. So I don't want to put any more officers down there than I need to. I'd much rather than be looking for burglars in Trafford or dealing with nighttime economy in Wigan or wherever they've come from. But I need to make sure that we've got a safe operation. And if one of the protesters goes under the wheels of a HGV and is seriously injured or killed, the flip side will be people will come back to me and say, why didn't you make it safe? Why didn't you have enough officers? So that's kind of the balancing act that we kind of work with, and at the moment it's around 60 officers. I think that's proportionate, and I never know day to day how many of the protesters are going to be there, but if we haven't got enough, then it means drawing officers away from normal duties and affecting the quality of the policing that the rest of Manchester gets. So it's under constant review. At the moment I think we're getting the balance about right, but that's why we've got the numbers of officers that we've got.
Okay, that's a good explanation. Now I know you use tactical aid unit officers down there. What I've heard is that tactical aid unit officers are trained to deal with violent situations like riots, football hooligans, things like that. Is that the case, or are they trained to deal with other things as well?
No, tactical aid unit officers are normal police officers. All police officers are trained to deal with everything and everything. So if they're not deployed to an event, they'll be on patrol dealing with whatever they've got. Tactical aid unit officers have additional skills over and above officers who might normally be on response. So they're trained to deal with particularly violent incidents, public order. They're also trained to search places, to do house-to-house inquiries on major inquiries. So they're given a whole set of additional training so that they can be used in a variety of ways. The tactical aid unit officers are extremely disciplined because they deal with violent situations. Actually, they've got a very high tolerance to poor behaviour. They're not fazed, they're certainly not intimidated, but I think the protesters have latched onto it as a bit of a target. They are subject to the same scrutiny as everyone else, and again, if people can produce footage of officers doing something wrong, then it'll be investigated. But the tactical aid unit officers are extremely professional, as are all the officers that have been down there, and I've seen no specific issues with their deployment as opposed to any other officers. Excuse me. Okay,
so they are trained to deal with violent situations. Are they trained to deal with peaceful protesters as well?
Absolutely. All officers are. That's the initial tactic of the police is to talk to people, and the tactical aid unit are exactly the same. Please don't think that they're given training in riot and nothing else. They're not like the CRS perhaps in France, who are brought in for specific situations and perhaps don't have the exposure to routine policing that the tactical aid unit or public order units in the UK would have. So I think it's probably a mistake to characterise them as people who are purely brought in for violent situations. They will deal with a range of policing issues. They are trained to deal with particular scenarios, but just because they're trained for that doesn't mean that's their first, they immediately defer to a particular way of doing things. They will deal in a normal way as a normal police officer would.
So what type of things do the tactical aid unit, what type of events do they normally get sent to? Is it things like that? Or
Well, they'll do anything and everything. They'll be on normal policing, they'll search things for murders, or if we've got the government coming, they'll search buildings. They will be deployed in public order situations because they're given a higher level of training than other officers. But that's part of their core training. They're used over and above the normal officers for those specific sorts of threats. So yes, they do get additional training at dealing with violent people, but that doesn't mean they will use those tactics in any given situation. They'll use the appropriate tactic for the level of threat that they're facing.
Okay. Now I know these officers wear, I don't know how you say it, SAP gloves, SAP gloves. I don't know if you want to explain what they are, and I want to ask why they wear them.
Yeah, the gloves that the officers use at Barton Moss are just normal leather gloves. They're not weighted gloves. They're not some sort of medieval gauntlet. Some of the public order gloves have some padding to stop the officers injuring the hands. And interestingly enough, the injuries that we've had so far to police officers were hand injuries where they've had to get a protester off a barbed wire fence, and another incident where they were cutting a protester from an obstruction that had been booby trapped with razor wire and glass in it. So in terms of the gloves, there's nothing mysterious about the gloves. I'll get you a set of gloves to look at. They are hand protection for the officers and not some sort of implement.
So the officers definitely have never used SAP gloves at this time?
In terms of your definition of SAP gloves, I'm not sure what you mean. I'm familiar with the two sorts of gloves that the police officers use, which are either a normal leather glove, which you would use if you're handling someone who perhaps was bleeding, or you didn't want to get some sort of contamination off them, or if you were dealing with someone and wanted to give some hand protection. And the other public order gloves are thicker leather. There's some padding on the back to protect the hand, but they're not a weapon of any sort. They are protective gloves for the hand.
Okay. When I've researched SAP gloves, I found that they are weighted gloves used in hand-to-hand combat.
No, I'm sorry, we don't use weighted gloves. I'm not sure of the definition of SAP gloves. That's something I have to look up. All I can tell you is the two sorts of gloves that the police officers use are the normal leather gloves that I've got that are used for the nefarious purpose of keeping your hands warm, or perhaps protecting you from any contaminants, and the public order gloves, which are padded, not weighted, but they're padded to give hand protection. We don't use weighted gloves as some sort of implement. Okay,
that's fine, just to clear that up.
Yeah.
I've heard about Barton Moss Days of Solidarity. I mean, GMB are there to aid the protesters.
Well, we're there to facilitate protest. There's interestingly been a number of days there where probably we've had the most number of protesters, and we've had fewer issues and fewer police officers deployed. I would happily not have any police officers down there. And as I say, some of the events, particularly on a weekend where there's been large numbers of people there and they've marched, we've hardly had any police deployment at all because there's no need. We will only respond if there's a need for us to go there, and if there isn't, we won't go.
Okay, I've been told about these Barton Moss Days of Solidarity, and I've looked up all the footage myself and seen the whole thing where they've had hundreds of people marching down the dual carriageway towards Barton Moss.
Yeah.
Now, from what I've heard from the protesters and from what I've seen myself online, there wasn't a police presence during those Days of Solidarity.
Yeah, there may have been one or two officers just to try and manage any traffic issues. But as I say, we only deploy if there's a threat. So if the protesters are there and behaving, no matter how many there are, aside from maybe trying to make sure there's no issues with traffic, we won't deploy officers. As I say, I would happily not have any officers there at all. And on certain days when deliveries have been made, we've tried deploying just liaison officers, and we've tried allowing the lorries to go in with no police officers at all. But typically when we do that, they block the lorries. There's been threats to the lorry drivers, and there's been some incidents of damage. So we've tried to police it with no police, and when we can, we will do. But what we typically find is that we then have to send police officers to try and manage the process.
Okay, so Was the police concerned with the safety of the protesters marching down the dual carriageway? And obviously marching down a dual carriageway isn't a very safe thing to do. Were the police there to ensure the protesters' safety during their right to protest?
I think people have got to take some responsibility for themselves. We have got a lot of commitments on the force, and we will try and send resources to where we need them to be. If people are organising marches, it's their responsibility to make sure they do it safely. Now, if people have a dialogue with us, we will try and assist with that. If things are going and there's no issues, then we won't send police officers. But actually, we can't actually babysit everyone doing everything. And on some occasions, it's probably better that we don't have police officers there, because if there's not police officers there, then some of the people in the protest, and some of the people in the protest, a lot of the people in the protest are peaceful people who have a really strong conviction about exploratory drilling, and we absolutely get that. But unfortunately, there's an element within the protesters, some anarchists, some people who are familiar faces at protests around the country, who quite frankly, I think, like causing problems with the police. Now, one of the ways to stop that happening is not to have any police there. So that's one of the considerations we'll have in balancing out, do we have police there, do we not have police there? So it's kind of judging all those things in the round to try and come to the right decision.
I mean, I know what a lot of the protesters and other people see it as almost GMP protecting this private company. You know how obviously it's iGas, who are a private company who are operating on the site. To them, it seems like you're almost protecting them, and then the days of solidarity when they're marching down the dual carriageway, you weren't there to protect them from the traffic, but you'll be at iGas to protect their private operation.
Yeah, I don't see that analogy at all, to be honest. iGas may be a private company, but they are lawful in what they're doing. So it's been licensed by Salford Local Authority, it's been licensed by the appropriate government agencies, so what they are doing is lawful, and they have a right to be able to go and do that. If the protesters choose to infringe on that right, there's a degree to which that's fine, that they've got a right to peaceful protest, and I stress peaceful protest. But we've got to weigh up the balance between allowing that peaceful protest and also allowing the people to go about the lawful business. And the other thing that we've got to factor in, and we've got to come back to, is to think about that local community. Because when the protesters blockade, normally, if it wasn't for police presence, they will blockade those HGVs going up the road all day. You just won't let them move. Well, that blocks the road for the companies that are there, the people who live on those roads, and it means that they can't go about their lives and the businesses as well. So that plays part of the balance as well. So we'll allow a slow walk to some degree, but we've got to be able to facilitate people doing about their local business. GMP are not anyone's private army. We don't do that. We try and balance things and manage it fairly. We get no financial pay from the company. It's nothing, you know, the conspiracy theories that you hear, quite frankly, are ludicrous. We are there trying to balance, and if we could do that without deploying any officers at all, we would do it, because there are lots of things we would rather do. This will cost us well over £1 million, and at this moment in time we can't particularly afford £1 million to spend on things that we'd rather not do it on. So there's no interest for us being in there. We'd rather not be there, but we need to go there because there's a threat to manage, and that's a threat to public order, and it's to try and allow people to go about their lawful business.
Okay, cool. Now going to the marches themselves, obviously there's lots of videos, I've witnessed it myself, of police putting their hands in people's backs. Is that a tactic to move them on? I mean, why does that happen when the protesters are walking, they're not standing still, but they're walking slowly, and the police officers will put their hand in their back to speed them up? Okay, well, there's a balance to be had here. It's been subject to court cases, and there is a footpath down Barton Moss Road. So the people have a legitimate access to use that footpath. It is also a private road, and is all on land owned by Peel. So Peel have made it clear as landowners that they view the camp and the people on that land who are protesting as trespassers. That notwithstanding, we need to allow a degree of protest. Now, people could protest in a number of ways. They could stand at the side of the road and protest. They could do it at the beginning of the road. There's different ways. There isn't a law or rule that says the only way you can protest is to walk slowly down the road. And I've mentioned I've got to minimise the disruption to the local community, so we're trying to find that balance.
Police officers can use force to keep people safe, prevent crime, and arrest people when they commit a crime. So those are the typical reasons you'd use it. My view is that by people refusing to move down that road, they're potentially committing offences, one of them being aggravated trespass. So actually it's perfectly proportionate and sensible, as long as it's the minimum force required, that we can put hands on people just to move them up the road, to balance that out and allow people to go about their business. So that's not assaulting people, that's not shoving people over. But the other side of it is that some of the protesters will push back on the police officers. Now that in itself is an offence. We give people latitude, we give people warnings, but in the circumstances I think it's proportionate and legal for police officers to move people down that road to try and balance those competing demands.
So you mentioned it's okay to use force. You said if a protester is standing still, but most of the time they are walking.
Well, I think there's a balance about how fast you walk. You know, I mean, we have timed at one occasion, I think it took us 50 minutes for a protester to take 30 heel-to-toe steps. Now the law, the general rule is you've got to act reasonably, and I think in terms of their desire to protest, and as I've said, it's written nowhere down that the only protest is to walk really slowly up the road. You've got to be reasonable in that, and we will facilitate reasonable acts as long as they're peaceful to facilitate that protest. But it's got to be reasonable for the HGVs, it's got to be reasonable for the local community. So it's a balance. I think we normally get it right. On some days we might not get it to the desire of the protesters. Equally, you know, the private companies tell me, and certainly the residents tell me, they're not happy with it. They say it's too slow. They would rather not have people on that road, stopping them. So we're in the middle really. So I have some sections telling me that's far too slow, move them, why are you allowing them to do it? I have the protesters saying we want to go slower. So the role I've got, I'm never going to keep everyone happy by definition, because you've got mutually exclusive objectives in this thing. So it's about keep that balance and keep it sensible and keep it fair, and it's a judgment call every day really, and that's why we have commanders on the ground who are used to it to try and work out what's reasonable. It's always done with dialogue. Whenever we engage with a protester, certainly wherever we can before an arrest, we'll go through a process called a 5-step appeal, which is nothing particularly scientific, but it gives everyone a bit of opportunity to think. So it'll be, okay, what I think what you're doing now is actually illegal, would you stop? And then they'll go on to look, here's a crime, there is a potential consequence if you carry on acting like that, would you please stop? Right, if you don't stop, you are going to be arrested. Then it's one last chance, stop doing that, or you'll be arrested, and then typically they'll be arrested. So all the way through, we're giving people that option. We're saying what we think you're doing is unreasonable, please move, please desist in that behaviour. So a lot of the time when people are arrested, they're actually making a conscious decision, because we're not springing surprises on them. We're actually trying to engage with them, explain to them, give them a conscious decision. So I actually think we've been incredibly reasonable. And the officers down there get an awful lot of abuse. It's a tactic. They've constantly got a camera shoved in the face, with people shouting at them, pushing them, jostling them. When officers have been identified on social media, some of the horrendous abuse, and some of it is vile abuse that they've gotten. We had an incident where a social worker was targeted for going down to check on the welfare of the children, and the abuse she got was absolutely vile. So when you've got that all going on, I think actually the professionalism and discipline of the police that they've shown down there is absolutely tremendous. And I can't think of another country in the world actually where the police would show such professionalism and actual tolerance for people on occasions being pretty vile to them. Okay.
Now, obviously, it's a human right to be able to protest freely. I don't know if you're sort of speeding up the walk. Do you think that's almost impeding their human right to protest, because they're not being able to protest in the way that they feel they should be able to? They're not walking as slowly as they want to.
Well, the right to peaceful protest, stress peaceful, is a human right, but it's a qualified human right. That means it's not an absolute. So it's not, you must be able to protest in any way you want, no matter what the consequences are. So it's a qualified human right. So then it becomes subjective on us to what degree we can perhaps impinge on that right to peaceful protest to actually balance off the other aims. And I mentioned the different competing aims. It's a human right to be able to go to work without being threatened and harassed. It's a human right to be able to live in your own home without being intimidated, without being obstructed. It's a human right to be able to enjoy your own property. Now, those human rights are mutually incompatible in this, because to entirely facilitate the protesters' right to protest means I would entirely deny those other rights. So again, it comes back to that competing demand. I cannot fully meet everyone's expectation under the Human Rights Act. So it's about balancing it so that we try and get it fair for the most people in the circumstances.
Okay. Now I know, obviously I mentioned I went down last week because the protesters were due to be evicted. Mm-hmm. Now, when I've spoken to many people about this, from what I've worked out, Peel they own all the land there,
yeah.
But the field which the protesters are camping on is leased out to a farmer, mm-hmm. and Peel obviously own the footpath. I mean, I imagine that it's up to the farmer if he wants the people evicted off his land, because they're camping on his land, it's leased to him.
No.
Is that not?
No.
I'm just wondering how that works.
The farmer is a tenant of Peel. So actually, in terms of land ownership, it's not massively straightforward. The protesters are camped on the verge next to the road. There was a hedge there, but actually the protesters have removed about 100 plus yards of the hedge. They're on land which is Peel's land. Peel own it, Peel and the Manchester Ship Canal Company, which I think is a derivation of Peel. It's their land, they've been to court, they've secured possession of it and an eviction notice for the protesters. So that's quite clear cut. The protesters are appealing to the Court of Appeal, as is their right, and whatever comes out, comes out. As and when, if the order is granted and they're to be evicted, that is a matter for Peel and High Court enforcement officers. So the police won't be evicting them. It's a civil matter. We will clearly be present to make sure that there's no violence, threats, and people don't break the law. But that is a matter between the landowner Peel and the High Court enforcement officers who will act on their behalf.
Okay. And finally, I know some of the arrests that have been made at the site have been thrown out of court when they've reached the magistrates for lack of evidence or whatever. Why
no,
does that happen?
Not quite accurate, I don't think. Clearly, with any court case, the reason we have courts is to decide whether people are innocent and guilty. That's right, that's the way we work. So we've arrested over 204 people. So of those, some of those people will be found not guilty. I'm not sure what the attrition rate is at court, but there will always be a certain proportion of people who are found guilty, some are found innocent. It's not our job to decide whether people are guilty or innocent. We have to reasonably suspect that people have committed an offence, and then there's a charging decision made, in most cases with CPS, and if they decide that there's a reasonable chance of conviction, then it goes forward to a court, and a court decides whether or not people are found guilty. So in any process there's a kind of attrition rate from arrest. Some will drop out, some are charged, some go to court, some are found not guilty. So I don't think in terms of the numbers arrested we're seeing anything other than kind of normal attrition rates. Some of the offences are really subjective. So if you break into someone's house and you're found there and you're stealing stuff, well, it's fairly clear cut. In this case, with offences of willful obstruction or aggravated trespass, there's a degree of opinion. So clearly where there's a degree of opinion, as opposed to clear cut, you have or you haven't, then there's always going to be a debate around that, and that's the purpose of the court, and we entirely respect that, and the court will come to the decisions that it comes to. I think what you're referring to is that the court took a view on the status of the road about whether or not it's a footpath or a private road, and there was legal discussion about whether you can obstruct a vehicle on a footpath. It's complicated because the footpath and the private road are in exactly the same place. So in exactly the same position you've got people who are there because it's a footpath, that's their legal right, and you got lorries that are legally there because it's a private road, and it's exactly the same place, but the law treats them differently. So it is quite complicated. The district judge took the view that you couldn't obstruct a lorry on a footpath, so in the light of that we reviewed our cases. The bulk of those cases are still going ahead because there was a concurrent obstruction with people on foot. So it's a mischaracterisation to say that we were wrong on law, it's been kicked out. The bulk of those prosecutions are going ahead, but as I've said, with any group of prosecutions there'll be an attrition rate at various stages and some will drop out. So I'm perfectly happy with the way that's going. I've no doubt some people will be convicted, some will be found innocent, and that's what we have a court system for, and that's absolutely fine.